The French prince was decomposing while still breathing. Louis Ferdinand wasn't dying. He was rotting from the inside out. His lungs were completely liquefying, the liquefaction rising up his throat in thick, black, rotting clumps of flesh. But the worst part? The royal physicians didn't save him. They tied him up, ripped his veins, and pinned him down to drain the blood from a melting corpse. Louis Ferdinand was the very antithesis of the era that produced him. His father, Louis XV, known to history with bitter irony as the Beloved, presided over a court of legendary debauchery and chronic political stagnation. The king was a man governed entirely by his appetites, manipulated by a succession of official mistresses, most notably Madame de Pompadour, who held more functional power than the king's own ministers. The French state was hemorrhaging money, engaged in disastrous foreign wars, and ignoring the simmering, desperate rage of the starving lower classes. Into this moral and political vacuum stepped Louis Ferdinand. From a young age, he looked at his father's court with undisguised contempt. He was deeply pious, fiercely intellectual, and rigidly moral. He surrounded himself with philosophers, military strategists, and reform-minded politicians, deliberately rejecting his father's sycophants. He represented a total rupture from the corruption of his father. For the people of France and for the frustrated nobility who saw the country careening toward a precipice, the Dauphin was the solitary beacon of hope. He was the strong, capable, iron-willed king waiting in the wings, the man who would purge Versailles of its parasites, balance the ruinous debts, and restore the dignity of the crown. He was a devoted husband and a father who took a hands-on approach to the education of his children, a rarity in royal circles. He possessed the physical stamina, the intellectual rigor, and the moral authority required to drag France back from the brink of disaster. He was the king France desperately needed. Then in August of 1765, following military maneuvers at the palace of Fontainebleau, the Dauphin developed a persistent cough. In a world ignorant of microbiology, a cough was easily dismissed as a chill. But this was Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it had entered a phase known to the era as galloping consumption. It was a pathogen that moved with terrifying predatory speed. The bacteria aggressively colonized his lung tissue, triggering a massive immune response that paradoxically accelerated the destruction. Tubercles formed, caseated and burst, turning healthy pink tissue into a soft, grayish-white mass resembling crumbly cheese. As the disease rapidly progressed, these necrotic areas liquefied. The Dauphin was literally melting from the inside. He insisted on maintaining his punishing schedule, attending state councils and reviewing troops while hiding blood-soaked handkerchiefs within his coat. He understood that to show physical weakness was to invite political instability. But the human body can only sustain so much catastrophic tissue loss before the facade crumbles. By late autumn, his robust frame had collapsed. He was severely emaciated, his skin drawn tight over his facial bones like pale parchment. His eyes sunk deep into his skull, burning with chronic fever. He was forced to his bed and the doors were sealed. It was here that the tragedy transformed from a biological inevitability into a prolonged, state-sanctioned torture. The royal physicians, considered the absolute pinnacle of medical science in the 18th century, were summoned. Armed with an unshakable belief in the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, they looked at a man dying of advanced tissue necrosis, severe dehydration, and systemic infection, and decided that his body simply needed to be emptied. Their primary weapon was the lancet. Believing that the Dauphin's fever and coughing were caused by a buildup of corrupt blood, they prescribed aggressive, unrelenting bloodletting. The physicians would restrain the exhausted prince and slice deep into the veins of his arms, his legs, and even his neck. They did not do this once. They did this daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Modern medical analysis of this practice is chilling. The Dauphin was already suffering from profound anemia due to the internal hemorrhaging in his lungs and severe malnutrition. By repeatedly opening his veins, the doctors were systematically destroying his blood pressure, drastically reducing the oxygen-carrying capacity of what little blood he had left, and actively starving his vital organs, including his brain and his heart. As the dark, sluggish blood flowed into the brass bowls, the Dauphin would slip into delirium, his weak voice begging them to stop, crying out that they were draining his soul. But royal protocol demanded action. The radicalizing philosophies of the Enlightenment and the furious resentment of the starving masses, these were massive, volatile forces that required an iron hand and a brilliant mind to navigate. Louis XVI had neither. He vacillated, he compromised when he should have stood firm, and he stood firm when he should have compromised. Many historians argue that had Louis Ferdinand lived, the trajectory of France might have been drastically altered. He already despised the corruption of the nobility and possessed the sheer force of personality required to enact brutal economic reforms. While it is debated whether the French Revolution could have been entirely avoided, it surely would have met a formidable adversary. The trajectory of Europe, the Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon, the millions dead in the subsequent wars, all of it traces directly back to the microscopic bacteria that hollowed out the lungs of the one man who might have stopped it. History is rarely made by grand sweeping forces alone. Often it hinges on the fragile, failing biology of a single human being. On the morning of December the 20th, 1765, a heavy, suffocating stillness fell upon the royal apartments. The wet, ragged breathing that had echoed through the corridors for months had finally ceased. Louis Ferdinand, the Dauphin of France, was dead at 36. The heir to the most powerful monarchy in Europe had been reduced to a skeletal, infectious corpse. As royal morticians quietly sealed his ruined body inside a massive lead coffin, King Louis XV wept. Confronted with the corpse of his son, his reaction was one of paralyzed shock. The steadying force of the future had been violently removed. The heaviest burden fell upon a quiet, awkward 11-year-old boy. Louis Auguste inherited his father's piety, but none of his commanding presence. Overwhelmed by the reality of his new position, the terrified child collapsed in tears. This foundational trauma birthed a crippling indecision, a weakness that would ultimately render him incapable of halting the brutal machinery of the French Revolution. The guillotine that would sever his head decades later was sharpened by the biological collapse of his father. As the political shock waves began to ripple outward from Versailles, a quieter secondary tragedy was already in motion within the royal apartments. Maria Josepha of Saxony, the widowed Dauphine, had performed her final duty. She had watched the physicians pack her husband's hollowed chest with spices, and she had watched the heavy lead coffin sealed shut, entombing the man she loved. But her physical ordeal was not over. It had only just begun. During the months she had spent in the sealed, infectious atmosphere of the sick room, leaning over his rotting lungs, wiping the infected blood from his chin, and breathing the aerosolized bacteria of his violent coughs, her fate had been sealed. The mycobacterium tuberculosis had quietly colonized her own respiratory system. At first, the symptoms were easily attributed to exhaustion and profound grief. She lost weight. She appeared pale and listless. The court assumed it was the natural melancholy of a devoted widow. But within weeks of his burial, the true nature of her decline became undeniable. A dry, persistent cough began to rattle in her chest. Then came the afternoon fevers, burning beneath her skin, followed by the terrifying, drenching night sweats. When she pressed a white linen handkerchief to her mouth to suppress a coughing fit, she pulled it away to find a bright, stark speck of arterial blood. The sheer psychological horror of her situation is difficult to overstate. Maria Josepha possessed no medical degree, but she possessed the brutal, intimate knowledge of an eyewitness. She knew exactly what that spot of blood meant. She knew precisely what the bacteria was beginning to do inside her chest. She had just watched the entire agonizing process from the front row. She knew that her lungs were beginning to form the same hardened nodules. She knew they would soon caseate, soften, and liquefy. She knew that the excruciating chest pains, the violent hemorrhages, and the suffocating sensation of drowning in her own fluids were coming for her. And most terrifying of all, she knew exactly how the royal physicians would respond. As her condition deteriorated, the same men who had bled her husband dry returned to her chambers. They brought the same brass bowls and the same sharpened lancets. They diagnosed her with the same imbalance of humors and prescribed the same aggressive bloodletting and violent purgatives. She was subjected to the exact same medical torture, stripped of her remaining strength, her immune system systematically destroyed by the men claiming to save her. Maria Josepha endured this nightmare for 15 agonizing months. She died on March 13, 1767. Her lungs reduced to the same necrotic ruins as her husband's, leaving her young. The doctors could not simply stand by and watch the heir die. They had to be seen intervening, even if their intervention was a methodical execution by exsanguination. When the bloodletting failed to halt the rotting of his lungs, the physicians escalated their assault. They turned to heavy toxic purgatives, convinced that the bad humors must be expelled through the digestive tract. They forced the prince to swallow massive doses of chemical laxatives, often concoctions heavily laced with toxic heavy metals like antimony and mercury. The physical reaction was violent and immediate. The chemicals triggered severe, uncontrollable spasms in his gastrointestinal tract. A body that had barely digested solid food in weeks was suddenly violently purged. The result was torrential bloody diarrhea that stripped the lining from his intestines. The violent cramping caused him to writhe in agony, compounding the immense pain in his chest. These purges triggered catastrophic dehydration, throwing his already failing kidneys into critical shock. The man lay in his own filth, too weak to move, his body forcefully evacuating fluid it desperately needed to survive. Every medical intervention designed to save him actively destroyed another layer of his biological defense. It was a symphony of ignorance, a horrific demonstration of how the very best care the 18th century could offer was functionally indistinguishable from torture. Yet amidst this gore and clinical brutality, a profoundly tragic human drama was unfolding. Royal protocol strictly dictated that members of the royal family be kept away from severe illness. The sick room was the domain of doctors, valets, and priests. But the Dauphine, Maria Josepha of Saxony, absolutely refused to leave her husband's side. She was not a passive observer. She became his primary caregiver. In an environment so toxic that seasoned courtiers refused to enter, She spent her days and nights leaning over his infectious body. When the violent coughing fits seized him, threatening to choke him on his own blood, she was the one who lifted him up, wiping the thick, putrid discharge from his mouth and chin. She cleaned his emaciated body, enduring the overpowering stench of his liquefied lungs and the chemical filth of the doctor's purges. She held his scarred, bruised arms during the bloodlettings, and she prayed with him through his fevers. It was an act of raw, unconditional love and absolute defiance of the rules of Versailles, and it was a death sentence. By breathing the heavily infected air of that sealed room, by constantly handling his blood and sputum, Maria Josepha contracted the very same aggressive strain of tuberculosis. Her devotion sealed her fate. She would watch her husband die, knowing intimately the exact horrific process that would soon claim her own life. She followed him to the grave just over a year later, a martyr to her own marriage. The Dauphin's psychological torment during these final weeks was profound. He was a deeply religious man, a devout Catholic who viewed the world through a lens of divine order. How did a man of faith reconcile his piety with this degrading, monstrous physical punishment? Records from his confessors suggest he framed his agony as a divine trial. He believed he was acting as a sponge, absorbing the sins of his father's corrupt reign and the decadence of France, paying the debt in his own flesh. He lay there, perfectly aware that his lungs were rotting away, feeling chunks of his own tissue detach and rise in his throat, and he accepted it as a necessary crucifixion. This psychological endurance, this grim stoicism in the face of medieval butchery and biological collapse, underscores the sheer force of his will. He remained lucid enough to dictate instructions for his children's education, explicitly demanding they be taught the realities of poverty and the heavy, unglamorous burden of the crown. He knew exactly what he was leaving behind, and he knew who was inheriting the catastrophe. The political consequences of his slow suffocation in that bed were quite simply the fulcrum upon which the history of the modern world pivoted. When Louis Ferdinand finally died on December 20th, 1765, drowning in a final massive hemorrhage of black blood and pus, he didn't just leave a grieving family. He left a gaping, catastrophic void at the heart of the French state. Because the strong, resolute king was dead, the burden of the crown passed to his son, the future Louis XVI. The boy was only 11 years old when his father died. He was notoriously shy, deeply indecisive, physically awkward, and entirely lacking the commanding presence and political intellect of the man who had just rotted to death. When Louis XV eventually died a decade later, the crown fell onto the head of a young man who was utterly unequipped to manage the monumental crisis tearing France apart. The crushing national debt, the famines, traumatized children entirely orphaned. The bodies of the Dauphin and the Dauphine were not laid to rest in the traditional royal necropolis of Saint-Denis. Following Louis Ferdinand's strict instructions, reflecting his disdain for the opulence of his father's court, even in death, his heavy lead coffin was transported to the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne in Sens. The procession was a somber, heavy affair, moving slowly across the freezing French countryside in the dead of winter. The massive lead box, designed to contain the biological hazard and the powerful stench of his decay, required significant effort to move. It was a dark, rolling monument to the fragility of power, passing by the fields of peasants who were already beginning to starve. A silent prelude to the violent reckoning that was gestating in the anger of the people. They laid him in a dark, cold crypt, sealing him beneath heavy marble, believing the story was finished, completely unaware that the most violent chapter of his physical existence was still decades away. For 29 years, the heavy, lead-lined sarcophagus of Louis Ferdinand sat in the freezing, absolute darkness beneath the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne in Sens. Above ground, a nation was steadily marching toward a slaughterhouse of its own making, but down in the crypt, a different, quieter violence was taking place. The men who sealed the Dauphin into that box believed they were preserving his royal dignity. They had packed his ruined chest cavity with aromatic spices and wrapped his skeletal, infectious frame in heavily embroidered shrouds. But by sealing him in solid lead, they had inadvertently engineered a chamber of absolute biological horror. Lead is entirely impermeable. It does not breathe. It keeps the outside world out, but more importantly, it traps everything inside. The aggressive mycobacterium tuberculosis that had hollowed out his lungs, along with the billions of natural bacteria residing in his necrotic gut, were locked in a damp, completely oxygen-starved vault. As the limited oxygen within the coffin was rapidly depleted, anaerobic bacteria took absolute control. This was not a clean, dry mummification. This was a wet, contained, accelerating putrefaction. The remaining soft tissues of the Dauphin of France, his muscles, his organs, the very face that courtiers had once bowed to, began to break down, liquefying into a dark, highly toxic biological sludge. The harsh chemical purgatives forced into his system by the royal physicians during his final days interacted with the natural gases of decomposition, creating a pressurized, foul-smelling soup of human decay. Over the decades, the pressure inside the airtight metal box steadily increased, causing the thick lead to groan and warp slightly under the strain of the trapped noxious gases. The Dauphin did not rest in peace. He lay stewing in his own liquefied ruin, a festering sealed biological time bomb waiting in the dark, lying right beside the similarly decomposing remains of his devoted wife, Maria Josepha. While the physical bodies of the monarchy's greatest hope dissolved into toxic slime, the political institution he left behind was suffering a parallel, equally grotesque decomposition. His son, Louis XVI, had ascended to the throne in 1774, carrying the deep, unhealed trauma of his parents' horrific deaths. The court of Versailles continued its relentless, blinding pageantry, operating as a glittering, oblivious parasite, feeding on the rapidly decaying body of France. The national debt, exacerbated by the catastrophic 7 Years' War and the massive financial drain of supporting the American Revolution, had reached an apocalyptic, unmanageable scale. In the countryside, the reality was bleak and desperate. The crops failed repeatedly. The peasants, who formed the absolute backbone of the French economy and bore the crushing weight of the nation's taxation, were reduced to boiling weeds and mixing dirt into their meager flour rations just to survive the winters. Yet the new king did nothing of substance. Louis XVI was paralyzed by chronic indecision, terrified of confrontation and wholly lacking the brutal, necessary pragmatism his father had possessed. When the ministers of finance presented him with the terrifying mathematical reality of national bankruptcy, he panicked. He retreated to his hunting lodges and repeatedly failed to force the wealthy aristocracy to pay their share. The decisive, forceful intervention that Louis Ferdinand would almost certainly have enacted never came. The rotting of the French state was left completely unchecked. The traumatized boy who had wept over his father's pus-filled corpse grew into a monarch who simply watched, paralyzed, as his kingdom bled out. By 1789, the pressure could no longer be contained. The French Revolution erupted, not merely as a political shift, but as a violent psychological snapping of a nation's collective mind. The people of France did not simply want legislative reform, they wanted blood. They wanted to tear down the gilded cages of Versailles and drag the untouchable powdered elites down into the mud. The monarchy was violently stripped of its divine right, exposed in the radical press as a bloated, corrupt syndicate of human leeches. When the starving, furious women of Paris marched on Versailles in October, they bypassed the elite guards and dragged the royal family back to Paris, effectively taking the King of France hostage in his own capital. The absolute illusion of royal supremacy, which Louis Ferdinand had fought so hard to maintain through his agonizing stoicism, was permanently shattered. The king was no longer a representative of God. He was an enemy of the people. As the revolution rapidly radicalized, passing into the hands of uncompromising extremists like Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, the political anger deepened into a visceral historical rage. They did not just want to execute the current king, they wanted to erase the entire bloodline. They wanted to obliterate the very memory that these people had ever held power over them, to retroactively destroy the aura of majesty that had subjugated France for centuries. In January 1793, the heavy blade of the guillotine severed the head of Louis XVI, definitively killing the boy who had been thrust into power by tuberculosis. But the execution of the living monarch was not enough to satiate the Republic. As the reign of terror descended, plunging France into a state of institutionalized paranoia, mass surveillance, and daily executions, the National Convention turned its furious, calculating gaze toward the dead. In August of 1793, a formal decree was issued that legalized the desecration of the past. The Republic desperately needed raw materials to fight the massive foreign armies massing on its borders to crush the revolution. They needed bronze from church bells to cast heavy cannons, and they desperately needed lead from royal coffins to cast musket balls. But the decree was not merely practical, it was intensely, violently symbolic. Barrère, a prominent and ruthless revolutionary, declared to the convention that the frightful memories of the kings must be physically destroyed. He argued that the monumental tombs must be shattered to properly celebrate the anniversary of the monarchy's fall. The physical eradication of the royal corpses transitioned from a mob impulse into a patriotic government-mandated duty. The Grand Royal Necropolis of Saint-Denis in Paris was the first to be gutted. Over several weeks, the graves of the kings and queens of France were smashed open, their remains dragged from their vaults, subjected to mocking theatrical trials by the mob, and dumped into massive pits filled with quicklime to dissolve their bones. But the hatred of the revolution was thorough, systematic, and possessed a very long memory. They remembered the Dauphin, who had deliberately hidden himself away in the provinces to avoid the royal crypts. By March of 1794, a detachment of revolutionary commissioners, accompanied by a highly radicalized local mob, arrived in the town of Sens. These were men and women forged in the bloody, starving crucible of the terror. They had watched their children suffer from malnutrition. They had seen heads roll by the thousands in the public squares, and they were utterly devoid of any lingering reverence for the dead Ancien Regime. They approached the towering Gothic Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, not as a sacred place of worship, but as a vault containing the hoarded, stolen wealth of the people. They carried heavy sledgehammers, thick iron pry bars, and massive rusted iron hooks, the heavy, brutal tools of slaughterhouses, entirely unfitting for a cemetery. They arrived solely to butcher the legacy of the past. They stormed the quiet, freezing nave of the cathedral, the heavy, violent thud of their boots echoing off the ancient stone pillars, their voices raised in vicious, mocking revolutionary anthems. They ignored the frantic pleas of the local clergy, shoving them aside as they marched toward the altar. With grim, focused intent, they descended the narrow, spiraling stone stairs into the deep crypt, bringing the violent, blood-soaked reality of the new republic directly to the sealed, silent door of Louis Ferdinand's tomb. The 29 years of absolute silence were over. The mob had arrived in the dark to collect the final, brutal debt. The crypt beneath the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne was utterly devoid of light, a freezing, silent stone vault that had insulated the royal dead from the explosive birth of the new world above. But the silence was violently shattered as the heavy oak doors at the top of the stairwell were kicked open. The flickering, harsh glare of oil torches bled down the spiraling stone steps, casting long, frantic shadows against the ancient walls. The revolutionary mob descended like a pack of starving wolves, their boots hammering against the stone, the metallic clatter of their heavy tools echoing in the confined space. They carried heavy masons' hammers, rusted iron crowbars, and thick knotted ropes. The air in the crypt, stagnant and freezing for 3 decades, was suddenly thick with the smell of burning pitch, unwashed bodies, and the raw electrical anticipation of sanctioned violence. They were not there to witness history. They were there to butcher it. At the center of the vault stood the magnificent marble monument holding the remains of Louis Ferdinand and Maria Josepha. It was a masterpiece of aristocratic mourning, carved with weeping angels and the proud, unyielding crests of the House of Bourbon and the House of Saxony. To the revolutionaries, it was an offensive, arrogant monument to the parasites who had bled their ancestors dry. The mob did not hesitate. The first swing of a heavy sledgehammer struck the face of a weeping marble angel, instantly decapitating it, sending shards of pristine white stone flying into the darkness. The crowd roared in approval. The destruction was methodical and completely devoid of reverence. Men stepped forward, swinging heavy iron mauls, obliterating the royal coats of arms, smashing the intricate carvings until the monument was nothing but a jagged heap of shattered, meaningless debris. They were physically dismantling the divine right of kings, rendering the untouchable absolute monarchy into a pile of gravel. Beneath the shattered marble lay the true prizes of the expedition, the heavy, immense lead coffins. Lead was the vital currency of the Republic's survival. It was required to cast the thousands of musket balls needed to supply the revolutionary armies fighting desperately on the borders of France. The royal dead were going to be conscripted to defend the very revolution that had overthrown them. But first, the coffins had to be breached. The men jammed the flattened ends of their heavy iron crowbars into the thick soldered seams of the Dauphin's sarcophagus. The metal was incredibly dense, designed specifically to hold back the forces of decay and keep the outside world permanently at bay. The men grunted, their muscles straining under the heavy wool of their coats, leaning their entire body weight against the iron levers. For several agonizing minutes, the lead refused to yield. Then, With a sudden violent screech of tearing metal, the heavy seal broke. What the revolutionaries expected to find was dust. They expected the clean, dry, sanitized bones of a prince, perhaps wrapped in tattered velvet, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of royal jewels. They were anticipating the romanticized, sterile death of the elite. What they unleashed instead was a concentrated biological nightmare. The instant the seal was broken, a pressurized hiss echoed through the crypt. The trapped gases of nearly 30 years of anaerobic putrefaction violently vented into the confined space. The stench that hit the mob was not merely unpleasant. It was a physical blow, a staggering, suffocating wall of concentrated death. It was the overwhelming sweet and sour reek of liquefied human tissue, fermented bodily fluids, and ancient rotting blood, heavily laced with the sharp chemical bite of the mercury and antimony the royal physicians had pumped into the prince before he died. Several of the hardened revolutionaries instantly dropped their crowbars and doubled over, violently vomiting onto the stone floor, their eyes watering profusely as their bodies instinctively rejected the toxic atmosphere. Undeterred by the biological assault, the most radical among them wrapped thick linen cloths around their faces and stepped forward, hooking their tools under the heavy lead lid and heaving it backward. It hit the stone floor with a massive, dull thud. The torches were brought closer, casting a harsh, unforgiving light into the metallic belly of the sarcophagus. There were no clean bones. There was no regal dignity. The impermeable nature of the lead coffin had created a horrific, sealed terrarium of decay. The moisture in the Dauphin's body, combined with the catastrophic necrosis of his lungs and the massive bacterial load in his intestines, had caused his flesh to break down into a thick, wet, corrosive sludge. The magnificent silk shrouds and the heavily embroidered garments of the Ancien Regime had been entirely saturated by this dark, viscous fluid. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the known world, the intelligent, pious hope of the French nation, was now lying in a deep, stagnant puddle of his own liquefied ruin. His skeletal structure was barely visible beneath the thick, dark, gelatinous mass of rotted tissue. His skull, once adorned with the powdered wigs of Versailles, was stained a dark, mottled gray, half submerged in the putrid soup of his own dissolved brain matter. This grotesque visual did not elicit pity from the mob. It acted as an accelerant to their hatred. This rotting, foul-smelling swamp of human remains was the ultimate proof of the revolution's core ideology. The aristocracy were not ordained by God. Their blood was not blue. They were not a superior species. They were meat. And like all meat left to rot in a sealed box, they turned into vile, toxic slime. The realization triggered a wave of dark, savage euphoria among the men in the crypt. The illusion was completely physically shattered. It was at this moment that the true desecration began. The men had brought tools specifically suited for the task of moving heavy, uncooperative mass. From the shadows, they produced heavy iron hooks. These were not tools of masonry or carpentry. They were thick, aggressively curved, heavily rusted iron hooks attached to thick hemp ropes. The exact implements used by the butchers of Paris to drag massive, bloody carcasses of slaughtered cattle across the filthy floors of the abattoirs. A massive man, a local butcher radicalized by the terror, stepped forward. He swung the heavy iron hook directly down into the sarcophagus. With a sickening, wet crunch that echoed over the jeers of the crowd, he drove the rusted spike directly into the decaying chest cavity of the Dauphin. the hook biting deep into the rotting ribcage and catching on the spine. A second man stepped forward and drove his hook violently into the lower half of the remains. "Drag him out!" a voice roared from the back of the crypt. The men tightened their grip on the heavy ropes, planted their boots firmly against the stone floor, and pulled with brutal, unceremonious force. The liquefied skeletal remains of Louis Ferdinand were violently yanked from the lead box. The wet, heavy mass of rotting flesh, bone, and saturated silk cleared the edge of the coffin and hit the stone floor of the crypt with a massive, wet slap. A thick splatter of black, putrid fluid sprayed across the boots of the revolutionaries. They did not stop, laughing, spitting curses, and singing the bloody verses of La Carmagnole. They began to drag the remains of the Dauphin across the rough, unforgiving flagstones. They repeated the exact same brutal process with the sarcophagus of Maria Josepha, the devoted wife who had sacrificed her own life out of love for the man currently being dragged like a slaughtered pig, was subjected to the identical humiliation. The iron hooks were driven into her decomposing flesh, and she was hauled out of her lead prison, hitting the floor beside her husband. The procession out of the crypt was a masterpiece of a historical nightmare. The men hauled on the ropes, dragging the two corpses toward the narrow stone stairs. As the heavy, rotting bodies were pulled up the steps, the skulls bounced and cracked against the sharp edges of the stone, the bones snapping, the heavy, dark fluids of their decomposition squeezing out of the saturated shrouds, leaving a thick, slick trail of royal decay painted across the steps of the cathedral. They emerged from the crypt into the vast, cavernous nave of Saint-Étienne. The soaring, stained glass windows, designed to filter the light of God down upon the faithful, now illuminated a scene of absolute profane butchery. The mob dragged the royal couple straight down the central aisle. The sound of the rusted iron hooks scraping against the ancient stone floor, mingled with the wet tearing of rotting flesh and the roaring, hateful cheers of the crowd, created a symphony of total societal collapse. "There is the Dauphin," someone screamed, pointing at the smeared, unrecognizable mass of tissue and bone being hauled past the altar. "Here is your Dauphin. Here is your king." They dragged them out through the massive wooden doors of the cathedral and into the freezing air of the city streets. The citizens of Sens, some horrified but many heavily radicalized and cheering, lined the streets to witness the ultimate degradation of their former masters. The bodies were dragged through the mud, the filth, and the horse manure of the public roads. Every bounce, every jarring scrape over the cobblestones tore more flesh from the bone, scattering the physical remnants of the House of Bourbon into the gutters of the Republic. The humiliation was absolute. It was a visceral public demonstration that the power of the monarchy was permanently, irrevocably dead. Their destination was a site explicitly chosen for its lack of dignity. Just outside the main cemetery walls, there was a deep, open trench. It was a mass garbage pit, a communal dumping ground used by the city for the disposal of diseased animal carcasses, slaughterhouse offal, and the discarded, rotting refuse of daily life. It was a place of flies, maggots, and absolute anonymity. The men dragging the ropes did not pause to offer a final word. They did not slow down. They hauled the shattered, leaking remains of Louis Ferdinand and Maria Josepha to the very edge of the filthy trench. With a final coordinated heave, they jerked the ropes upward and violently kicked the remains forward. The Dauphin of France and his Dauphin tumbled over the edge. They fell into the muddy, freezing depths of the pit, landing with a heavy, wet thud amidst the rotting bones of stray dogs and the discarded garbage of the city. The iron hooks were yanked free, tearing the last remnants of flesh from the ribs. The mob stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the scattered ruined piles of bone and sludge that had once commanded the wealth of an empire. A cart loaded with quicklime was pulled to the edge of the trench. The caustic white powder was shoveled in massive quantities directly over the corpses, a chemical fire designed to rapidly eat away whatever flesh the tuberculosis and the decades of putrefaction had left behind. They shoveled dirt and heavy rocks over the lime, packing the earth down tight with the heels of their boots. In a matter of minutes, the physical existence of Louis Ferdinand was entirely erased. There was no marker. There was no headstone. There was only flattened mud and the absolute crushing anonymity of a pauper's grave. The man who was born to rule the world had been violently returned to the earth, not as a king, but as a piece of toxic trash. The quicklime began its work immediately. The chemical reaction of calcium oxide is incredibly violent when introduced to moisture. The remains of the Dauphin and Dauphine, hauled from their lead sarcophagi, were entirely saturated with the wet, liquefied byproducts of 30 years of anaerobic decay. As the heavy white powder settled over their shattered bones and rotting flesh, it hydrated instantly. The garbage pit literally began to boil. The temperature beneath the packed earth spiked as the caustic chemical ate through the remaining organic tissue, turning the sludge into a searing, bubbling lye. It stripped the last remnants of the royal shrouds, dissolved the cartilage, and aggressively pitted and weakened the dense bone structure. The revolutionaries walking away from the mass grave did not merely bury the Dauphin. They initiated a thermal and chemical cremation in the mud. The absolute erasure of Louis Ferdinand was not a metaphor. It was a rapid, scientifically observable process happening beneath the boots of passing citizens and stray dogs. The sheer totality of this destruction would only become apparent decades later, adding a final bitter postscript to the tragedy. The French Revolution eventually devoured its own architects. The guillotine claimed Robespierre and the radicals. The Republic gave way to the empire of Napoleon, which in turn collapsed on the battlefield of Waterloo. In 1814, the wheel of history violently turned again, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored. The new king was Louis XVIII. He was the son of Louis Ferdinand, the same child who had been left traumatized by the tuberculosis that swept through the royal apartments in 1765. Sitting on his newly reclaimed throne, one of his first acts was to order the recovery of his parents' remains. He wanted to rescue them from the garbage pit in Sens and grant them the magnificent state funeral they had been denied. Commissioners were dispatched to Sens with royal authority and unlimited funds. They located the municipal dumping ground outside the cemetery walls. They hired laborers to dig into the filth. But the mob of 1794 and the quicklime had done their jobs with terrifying efficiency. The men dug through layers of compacted trash, animal bones, and dark contaminated soil. They found shattered fragments of heavy lead, the twisted, torn remnants of the sarcophagi that the revolutionaries had hacked apart. But they found almost no identifiable human remains. The chemical fire of the calcium oxide had dissolved the physical reality of the Dauphin into the surrounding dirt. There was no skull to crown, no hands to fold in prayer. The royal investigators were forced to gather up a few stray, unidentifiable fragments of bone and handfuls of the dark, contaminated earth itself, placing this miserable collection of dirt and refuse into a new box. This box was eventually placed in a restored monument inside the cathedral. The monarchy had returned, but it was forced to mourn over a pile of garbage-soaked dirt, pretending it was the sacred flesh of their ancestors. This profound physical absence mirrors the massive political absence Louis Ferdinand left in French history. The microscopic bacillus that hollowed out his chest did not merely kill a man, it executed a timeline. His sudden absence created a fatal vulnerability in the Bourbon dynasty. The monarchy did not fall simply because the peasants were hungry. Peasants had starved for centuries without successfully toppling the state. The monarchy fell because the state apparatus was bankrupt, and the man at the helm, Louis XVI, was fundamentally incapable of the ruthless pragmatism required to force the aristocracy to surrender their tax exemptions. Louis Ferdinand, by every historical account, possessed that exact ruthlessness. He was a man who openly despised the parasitic nature of his father's court. He understood the precarious financial reality of the nation. Had he lived to wear the crown, the clash between the throne and the nobility would have happened a generation earlier, directed by a king with an iron will rather than a king paralyzed by anxiety. He might have been a tyrant, or he might have been a great reformer, but he would not have been a passive victim. The bacterium that liquefied his lungs removed the immune system of the Bourbon dynasty, leaving a weak, indecisive shell to be crushed by the immense pressure of the late 18th century. The story of Louis Ferdinand is the ultimate dismantling of human arrogance. It is a narrative that forcefully rejects the sanitized, romanticized versions of history we are often sold. We are conditioned to view the past through the lens of grand decisions, sweeping battles, and the divine right of kings. We look at the gilded halls of Versailles and see power made manifest in gold and silk. But the agonizing death and grotesque posthumous mutilation of the Dauphin strip away that gilded veneer to reveal the brutal, unvarnished mechanics of reality. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity that all political power, all wealth, and all social hierarchy are entirely subordinate to the fragile, failing biology of the human animal. The men who ruled the world were entirely at the mercy of microscopic organisms they could not see, and physicians whose ignorance was more lethal than the diseases they treated. The doctors who bled him dry and poisoned his ruined intestines believed they were masters of science, just as the revolutionaries who dragged his rotting corpse with meat hooks believed they were the masters of history. Both were arrogant, both were brutal, and both ultimately failed to alter the fundamental truth of the human condition. Louis Ferdinand's life was defined by the immense weight of the crown he was destined to wear, but his legacy is defined by the absolute vulnerability of the flesh he inhabited. He stands as a stark, unavoidable reminder that the distance between the absolute pinnacle of human power and a rotting, anonymous trench of garbage is astonishingly short. It is a distance bridged not by the fall of empires, but by a simple cough, a microscopic bacterium, and the inescapable equalizing force of mortality. The history of the world is not just written in the treaties signed by kings. It is written in the blood, the pus, and the shattered bones they leave behind in the dirt.